and they tell exciting stories about how gods intermingled with human beings and actually had a hand in the creation of human beings.
The Sumerian king list is one of the oldest records on Earth. It names rulers who supposedly lived for tens of thousands of years. Scholars laughed it off as myth. Then scientists fed the whole list into Grok AI, along with flood myths, star records, and bloodline data. The pattern that came out is chilling. The kings were not being described like humans. The impossible reign lengths. The Sumerian king list opens with names that almost nobody remembers today. Alulim, the very first king, ruled the city of Eridu. After him came Alalngar, then Enmenluana. These were not minor figures. The tablets list them with full titles, full city names, and full reign lengths. Each one is treated as a real historical ruler, written into stone with the same care as any later king. But the reign lengths break every rule we know about human life. Alulim is said to have ruled for 28,000 years, Alalngar for 36,000 years, Enmenluana for even longer. These are not small exaggerations. These are numbers no human body could ever survive. A normal life is maybe 80 years. These kings ruled for hundreds of normal lifetimes, each. The numbers do not slow down for the next few rulers either. They stretch on and on until you start to feel the weight of how strange it is. The records held a secret nobody had decoded. For most of modern history, scholars looked at these numbers and shrugged. They called them symbolic. They said the Sumerians used big numbers to show prestige, the way we might say a leader is bigger than life. They said the numbers were religious, not factual. They said the early scribes were exaggerating for effect. That answer worked for a long time. It made the king list easier to file away. It let universities teach it as a poem rather than a record. The huge numbers got a small footnote, and the conversation moved on. Then Grok AI looked at the same numbers and saw something nobody had seen before. The numbers were not random. They followed a math pattern. They lined up with star cycles. They matched events in the sky that the Sumerians tracked very carefully. The scribes were not making things up. They were counting something specific. Grok pulled out three numbers that kept showing up across the reigns: 3,600, 43,200, 72,000. These were not lucky guesses. These numbers tied directly to Mesopotamian astronomy. The Sumerians used a base 60 system, and 3,600 is 60 times 60. It mattered to them the same way 100 matters to us. But the numbers go further. 43,200 lines up with cycles in the sky that take thousands of years to complete. 72,000 ties to long star drifts that only people watching the heavens for many lifetimes could ever notice. These are not the kind of numbers a casual scribe would pick by accident. When Grok lined them up against the reign lengths of each king, it found the lengths were built from these astronomical units. Almost every long reign was a multiple of one of these numbers. That is the work of a coded record, not a tall tale. The numbers were not random. They were encoded. The kings were treated like a separate species. When Grok compared the words used for kings to the words used for normal humans, the gap was huge. Normal humans were called by simple terms: workers, farmers, builders. Their lives were short, their names rarely written down, and their bodies described in plain ways. Kings got different words entirely. They were called descended, appointed from heaven, bearers of radiant blood, carriers of divine flesh. The scribes did not mix these terms up. They kept them locked to the royal lines and never used them for common people. Across hundreds of tablets, the pattern holds. That kind of word split does not happen by accident. One phrase shows up over and over at the start of new dynasties. After the kingship descended from heaven, it opens the king list itself. It marks the start of new ruling lines. It is treated as the most important event in the record. Stop and read it slowly. Kingship did not grow out of the people. It did not rise from a strong warrior taking power. It did not come from a wise elder chosen by the village. It came from the sky, downward, into the hands of a chosen few. The Sumerians did not write this phrase as a poem. They wrote it as a fact. They believed rulership was something handed down from above, like a tool dropped into the hands of a worker who could not have made it himself. That single line changes everything that follows. Grok flagged more strange notes about the kings. Their eyes were said to shine. Their bodies were taller than normal men. Their voices terrified people who stood near them. Their lifespans were many times longer than the workers around them. Their skin was sometimes described as glowing in low light. These are not small differences. These are the kinds of traits that would mark a being as physically different, not just socially different. The scribes had no reason to invent these details for political flattery. Flattery does not need glowing skin to work. A simple king praised by his court can be loved without his body being described as unnatural. The descriptions read more like field notes than worship. Put it all together, the king spoke differently, looked different, lived longer, and came from above. The scribes did not treat them as humans who were lucky. They treated them as beings of a different kind, walking among the people, but not really one of them. This raises a hard question. What if the ancient Sumerians were not using poetic language at all? What if they were writing what they actually saw? Tall, long-lived, glowing rulers, dropped into power from somewhere unknown, ruling over short-lived workers who never reached their height. The tablets were not lifting kings up with metaphors. They were marking them as something else. The bloodline pattern. Grok couldn't ignore. The next pattern Grok found is hard to swallow. Royal families in ancient Sumer did not marry outside their line. Kings married their sisters, kings married their daughters, kings married close cousins. The same pattern shows up in Egypt with the pharaohs. The same pattern shows up in other early kingdoms across the world. This was not a small habit. It was the rule. Royal blood stayed inside royal walls. A common woman almost never became a queen. A common man almost never became a king. The lines were sealed off, generation after generation. That kind of strict rule must protect something specific. Grok pulled out repeated words tied to royal birth: purity, sacred inheritance, divine seed. These words show up in tablets that have nothing to do with religion. They show up in property records, marriage contracts, and tax lists. The bloodline was not just respected, it was watched. A king without the right bloodline was no king at all. A child born to the wrong mother lost everything. The records show cases where royal children were removed from the line because their birth did not meet the rules. The seed itself was the prize, more than the throne. That tells us the kingdom mattered less than the blood inside the king. Later dynasties did the same thing. Egyptian pharaohs married within their family for centuries. The famous boy King Tutankhamun was the son of a brother and sister. Sumerian priest kings did the same. Other early monarchies across the ancient world followed the same closed-loop pattern. The simple reason given in old history books is that royal families wanted to keep power inside the family. That is true on the surface. But it does not explain why almost every early ruling line did it, even ones with no contact between them. Something deeper was being protected, something inherited, something that could be lost if mixed with common blood. The pattern Grok found looks less like politics and more like a breeding program. Selective marriages, closed lines, strict checks on who could carry the next generation, records kept of birth, body, and trait, children removed when they did not match. This is how you preserve a genetic feature. This is how you keep a trait from fading out. Farmers do it with cattle. Dog breeders do it with prized lines. The royal families of ancient Sumer seem to have done it with themselves. The kings behaved less like politicians and more like caretakers of a biological program. Before the flood. Almost every old culture remembers a flood. The Sumerians wrote about Ziusudra, a man warned by a god to build a boat. The Babylonians wrote about Utnapishtim. The Bible tells the story of Noah. Other floods show up in stories from China, Greece, India, and the Americas. The details match too closely to be 3 separate inventions, much less 10. Something happened. A massive water event left a scar on human memory so deep that it survived in every direction, carried by people who had no contact with each other. That kind of shared scar does not come from imagination. It comes from a real wound. The flood is not a side note. It is the hinge that splits ancient history in two. This is where Grok found one of the cleanest patterns in the whole list. Before the flood, kings ruled for tens of thousands of years. After the flood, the numbers crash. Reigns drop to hundreds of years, then to dozens, then to numbers we would call normal today. The fall is not slow, it is sharp. Right at the line where the flood is recorded, the lifespans break. The kings before the flood read like beings of another order. The kings after read like long-lived men, then like normal men, then just men. It looks like a battery running out. Whatever powered those long lives lost its charge. But not everything was lost. Grok found that certain royal names, symbols, and titles carried across the floodline. The bloodline did not die out entirely. A few survivors kept going, kept ruling, kept passing the seed down. The kings after the flood were weaker, shorter-lived, and less radiant. But they were still tied to the line before. Whoever planned the survival did it on purpose. Boats were not random. Warnings were not random. The right people were saved, and the records went with them. Something was preserved through the catastrophe, by choice. The flood did not just kill people, it changed what kingship was. Before, kings were near gods on earth. After, kings were men with fading echoes of something greater. The line continued, but the power inside it dimmed with each generation. It was almost as if the flood did not erase the kings, it weakened them. The non-human traits hidden in the text. The deeper Grok dug, the stranger the descriptions of kings became. Glowing skin, radiant eyes, voices that froze people in place, bodies that gave off a heat or light that workers could not stand to be close to for long. Stories of kings whose stare made people kneel without being told. These are not the kinds of details you invent to flatter a leader. A normal king can be praised without his eyes being said to glow. A normal ruler can be feared without his body being described as too bright to look at directly. The scribes wrote these traits down as facts, the same way they wrote down crop counts. The records read like reports of beings the writers did not fully understand. Some kings were said to be giants, towering heights, strength that no normal man could match, endurance that let them work or fight for days without rest. These descriptions match later giant stories from other cultures, including the Bible, where the Nephilim are described as offspring of heavenly beings and human women. The match across cultures is striking. Different peoples, different languages, different lands, all describing the same kind of beings. Tall, strong, long-lived, tied to the sky in some way. Either we are looking at the world's most successful myth, or we are looking at the memory of something real. Grok noticed the descriptions do not drift much. They stay tight across regions. The Sumerians had a word for the powers of civilization. They called them the ME. The ME included things like writing, law, kingship, music, war, and even certain crafts. The ME were treated as objects you could give or take, hold or lose, hide or display. But the ME were not for everyone. Only certain bloodlines could hold them. Only certain rulers could pass them down. A common man could not pick up a ME and use it. The texts treat them like keys that only fit certain hands. Grok noticed that the ME always travel with the royal line. Where the bloodline goes, the powers go. Where the bloodline fades, the powers fade with it. Put the traits together. Glowing skin, huge size, long life, voices of power. tied to specific bloodlines, holders of knowledge that common humans could not access. This list reads less like a description of human leaders and more like a description of beings built or shaped on purpose. We do not have to say for sure how they were made. The tablets do not explain that part. But the shape of the data points away from normal humans and towards something enhanced, by means we cannot fully name today. The king list stopped looking like mythology and started looking like inheritance records. The sky connection. Sumerian rulers were always tied to the sky. Their crowns carried star symbols. Their thrones faced certain directions. Their reigns were marked by eclipses, planet movements, and other sky events. The Sumerians watched the heavens for hundreds of years and tied royal events to what they saw above. One sky object keeps coming up. The Sumerians called it Nibiru. They described it as huge, with a long orbit that brought it close to Earth and then took it far away again. The return of Nibiru was treated as a major event, worth recording across many lifetimes. The kings in the sky were never far apart in the records. Grok ran the king list dates against ancient star records. The match was tight. Rain changes happened near eclipses. New dynasties started near planetary alignments. The flood event lined up with a major sky event. The Sumerians were not just tracking politics. They were tracking the sky and the throne at the same time. This kind of careful linking suggests the kings believed their power was tied to the heavens in a real way, not as a story, as a working connection. When the sky moved, the throne moved with it. The scribes treated the heavens as part of the royal record. The texts speak of beings who came down from the sky. The Sumerians called them the Anunnaki. The word itself means something close to those who descended from above. These beings are tied to the gods in the older readings, but Grok pulled out lines that make them sound more like visitors than spirits. The Anunnaki gave knowledge. The Anunnaki gave power. The Anunnaki gave the the sacred objects of civilization. And the Anunnaki, according to the texts, were the source of the royal bloodline. The kings were said to be descended from them, mixed with human mothers, carrying their seed forward into history. That would explain why the kings looked, lived, and acted so differently from common humans. The Sumerians did not just dress up their rulers in fancy clothes and call them divine. They wrote, in tablet after tablet, that the kings carried real blood from beings who came from the sky. They believed it. They built their whole society around it. The rulers of ancient Sumer may not have claimed divine ancestry as propaganda. They may have believed it literally. The AI reconstruction. For most of history, scholars only saw fragments of the king list. A tablet here, a piece there. Some kept in London, some in Baghdad, some in private hands. The languages were studied one at a time, often by people who did not speak the others. The astronomy was studied by a different group. The bloodlines were studied by yet another. Nobody had every piece in the same room at the same time. Even the best scholar in any field could only see one slice of the whole picture. The full pattern stayed hidden, not because anyone hid it, but because no human mind could hold all the parts at once. That changed when AI entered the picture. Grok pulled in the full king list, every known fragment, every variant, every damaged piece. It pulled in the astronomy records the Sumerians left behind. It pulled in the flood stories from every culture that had one. It pulled in the bloodline records, the marriage contracts, and the symbols carved on every throne. Then it lined them up. It checked which names appeared in which records. It matched reign lengths against star cycles. It mapped bloodlines against the the sacred powers. It tracked symbols across the floodline and noted which ones survived. The picture came together piece by piece, like a torn photograph being taped back together after centuries. What Grok found is a clear three-tier system. The pre-flood kings, with their huge reigns and near-divine traits, sit at the top. The transitional kings, who lived long but not impossible lives, sit in the middle. The post-flood kings, with shorter lives that look more like ours, sit at the bottom. Lifespans drop as you move down. Titles shrink. Symbols fade. The radiant traits described in early kings disappear by the time you reach the latest ones. The decline is steady, like a signal getting weaker the further you move from the source. The list reads like a record of something fading out. We are taught that human history is a climb. Stone tools, then metal, then writing, then science, then space. Up and up, from primitive to advanced. The king list flips that story on its head. The list shows the opposite. The earliest rulers were the most powerful, the longest lived, the most radiant. Each generation after them was smaller, shorter, dimmer. By the time you reach the kings, we can verify through normal archaeology. The magic is gone. Only men remain. Civilization may not have started with primitive humans becoming advanced. It may have started with advanced rulers slowly becoming human. What if the king list was literal? Go back to the opening line. After the kingship descended from heaven. We have read it as poetry for so long that the literal meaning feels strange. But what if the Sumerians meant exactly what they wrote? What if rulership really did come from above? What if the first kings really did arrive from the sky, bringing their bloodline, their powers, and their knowledge with them? What if the long reigns and glowing eyes and giant bodies were not myth at all, but memory? That single shift changes how we read every page after. The earliest rulers may have been hybrids, born from sky beings and human mothers. They may have been engineered elites, shaped on purpose to lead and live longer. They may have been descendants of something we no longer have a name for, walking among short-lived workers who could not match them in body or mind. Their bloodlines survived the flood through careful planning. They thinned out over generations as the seed mixed with common humans. They faded into the ruling families of later ages, weaker but still tied to the original line. We may have been ruled all the way down by traces of that line. Floods erased cities, wars burned libraries, conquerors rewrote histories to fit their own claims. Languages died and took their secrets with them. The men who held the deepest knowledge did not always pass it on, and some of them were killed before they could. The truth did not vanish in one blow. It was scraped away by time, fire, water, and forgetting, until only fragments were left in baked clay. Grok found those fragments and put them back together. The Sumerian king list may not be mythology at all. It may be the final surviving record of a time when humanity was ruled by something that only looked human. And if Grok AI is right, the bloodlines of those kings may never have completely disappeared from the world we live in today.